The room held its breath. Shadows shifted behind glass walls. Whispers of power and prejudice tangled in the air. A presence, quiet yet undeniable, stirred unease among the privileged few who believed their empire was untouchable. They had no idea the storm sitting silently among them carried the weight to unravel it all. This wasn't just another player on the board. It was a reckoning wrapped in calm, a force that would expose the cracks beneath polished surfaces and bring long-hidden truths crashing down. Behind every sneer and dismissal lay a secret power waiting to ignite. Stay with us, like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, because this is a story that will change everything you thought you knew. Laurel Wynn had walked into hundreds of lobbies like this one, glass-wrapped, steel-ribbed cathedrals of money where the walls gleamed too much and the smiles rarely reached the eyes. But today wasn't just another routine visit. She wore her status like her tailored navy suit, crisp, clean, and deliberate. Her pumps clicked softly on the polished marble as she passed through the revolving doors of Hale Bank's flagship location, a symbol of old money and modern muscle in the financial world. The space was cavernous and cool, designed to make clients feel simultaneously small and privileged. Tall white pillars framed a grand chandelier suspended above the atrium, dripping light like cold diamonds onto the floor. It wasn't just architecture, it was performance. And Laurel was well aware of her role in it. But she didn't expect the opening act to be a trap. The security guard moved in with no greeting, no nod of recognition, just a palm up like a stop sign. He didn't say her name, didn't ask for ID, just pointed to her leather case, silent and expectant. Behind her, a tall man in khakis and boat shoes brushed past unchecked. Another man followed with a golf bag slung over his shoulder and a branded Hale Bank fleece. Both were met with nods. Laurel held the guard's gaze, then slowly unzipped her case and revealed the embossed folders, one marked with a discreet Wynn Group seal, subtle, but unmistakable in elite financial circles. The guard's eyes paused on the logo, his expression hard to read, before he gave her a slight nod and waved her through. She didn't say thank you. He hadn't earned it. Approaching the main reception desk, Laurel encountered a woman with a platinum bun and the brittle smile of someone rehearsing civility. The receptionist glance flicked up and down Laurel's frame with the speed and dismissiveness of someone scanning for a brand label that didn't register. "Name?" the woman asked, not lifting her hands from the keyboard. "Laurel Wynn, 10 o'clock. With Mr. Derek Nile," Laurel replied, her tone calm and practiced. The woman didn't respond. She typed, waited, then frowned slightly and said, "One moment," before turning to her monitor again. No further acknowledgement came. No verification call. No offer of water or explanation. After a pause, the woman reached into a drawer and slid a form across the desk without looking up. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Stranger Verification Form." Laurel scanned it, name, phone, ID type, nature of business. It was the kind of form given to walk-ins or flagged accounts. Not someone with a confirmed meeting, and certainly not someone like her. With a cool expression, Laurel took the clipboard and pen. She didn't argue. She'd learned not to argue with foot soldiers. You watch. You remember. You burn it in. She completed the form with meticulous precision, slid it back, and waited. The receptionist told her, without meeting her eye, "You can wait in the overflow lounge." Laurel looked past her into the main client waiting area, half empty, softly lit, with leather chairs arranged like a high-end airport lounge. Then to the right, behind a decorative screen, she saw the overflow area. Smaller chairs, fluorescent lighting, no refreshments. She walked to the corner without a word, sat in the hard-backed chair like it was a throne, and waited. 20 minutes ticked by. One by one, white clients walked in, announced by name, escorted up smiling. A couple in pastel outfits were offered sparkling water before they even reached the desk. A young man in jeans and a hoodie, clearly an heir, not a professional, was welcomed by name and taken straight to the elevators. Laurel sat, hands folded neatly on her briefcase. She didn't scroll, didn't fidget. The message was clear. She was not to be mistaken for less. At 10:23 a.m., 23 minutes after her scheduled meeting, she returned to the front desk. The receptionist looked up with faint irritation, lips tight. "Yes." Laurel remained composed. "I'm scheduled at 10, with Mr. Nile." The woman's fingers danced nervously over the keyboard. She didn't respond immediately, but then said, "He may be delayed. Please continue waiting." It was then that the elevator chimed. She had said nothing when Derek Nile left her there, offering no explanation and not bothering to apologize for the setting. The room was not one of oversight. It was one of intent, meant to strip her presence of dignity by slowly suffocating it with discomfort. There was no screen for presentations, no water on the table, no signal that this space had ever hosted anyone of importance. Laurel removed her folder from her briefcase and placed it on the table carefully, her posture unwavering. Even as sweat began to form at her lower back, she remained composed, knowing full well that every detail was curated to provoke reaction. But Laurel Wynn didn't react. She documented. She could hear the hum of activity outside the room, faint footsteps and short bursts of laughter. Through the glass slit on the door, she caught glimpses of passing assistants carrying trays, steaming cups, white linen napkins, cut fruit, tiny pastries arranged like edible jewelry. One tray passed by twice, its bearers heading toward the executive boardroom down the hall, a room that had been empty when Laurel arrived, but now evidently hosted someone of greater priority. The door to that room remained open, just enough for her to catch a flash of movement. A man, likely in his late 50s, tall with swept-back hair and the weathered polish of inherited wealth, leaned back in a high-back chair while sipping from a white ceramic cup. A staffer adjusted the projector for him, while another set up a touchscreen tablet at his side. That room, Laurel knew from previous experiences, was meant for top-tier investor meetings, complete with a private elevator, in-room media, and direct interface to the bank's asset management division. She should have been there. Instead, she had been parked here, like a courier delivering someone else's paperwork. The knock came 20 minutes late. A junior associate entered, expression unreadable behind practiced politeness, carrying a thin blue folder tucked under one arm and a silver pen in the other. He did not introduce himself, did not offer his hand, merely placed the folder on the table in front of Laurel. Its cover read, "Standard Personal Savings Growth Tiers." She did not look up right away. Instead, she stared at the words on the folder for a moment, as if trying to decipher them in another language. Then, slowly, she raised her gaze to meet his. He blinked, clearly unsure how to respond, and quickly stepped back without offering further documents. She slid the folder aside, opened her own, and exposed the data sheets. Tiered capital structure, equity transition models, intercorporate bond transitions, and offshore protection clauses. An $8.4 billion investment structure crafted by our own team over the past 2 months. None of that was in the blue folder. That packet was designed for someone looking to open a high-interest savings account, not someone managing institutional wealth. Laurel looked at the folder again, then at the door the associate had exited through, leaving it slightly ajar. From her chair, she could see a whiteboard leaning against the wall in the hallway. On it, written in marker under today's date, was a list titled High-Value Walk-ins. For names were listed in neat block letters. Hers wasn't one of them. The air conditioning unit in the ceiling of her room let out a mechanical cough and then shut off altogether, sealing the heat inside. A long, buzzing silence followed. Laurel folded her hands atop her real documents, patient and poised. It wasn't incompetence she faced, it was a strategy. Demote silently, avoid confrontation, drown her in subtle inconvenience until even someone of her level might question their own footing. But her memory didn't blur under heat. It sharpened. A younger Laurel might have risen, demanded, confronted. But not this version. This Laurel waited. Let the silence compound. Let the room degrade. Let the offense complete itself, so there would be no mistaking it for anything else. A low tone echoed outside the hallway, followed by the whir of a service elevator. The same associate returned, this time walking briskly past her door, headed somewhere else, holding 2 tall glasses of citrus-infused water and a clipboard labeled Q2 Liquidity Briefing. A moment later, Derek reappeared, leaning halfway into the room, feigning pleasant indifference. "Let's take this upstairs," he said without expression, as if she had wandered into the wrong space on her own. He did not apologize, did not offer to carry her documents. As they walked past the boardroom where pastries were being cleared and a projector still glowed faintly, the man inside stood and shook hands with 3 bankers. He never looked toward Laurel, but she looked at him. She recognized him. Marshall Crest, CEO of a private equity firm with less than 1/3 the capital she controlled. He had arrived late. He had no scheduled meeting. And yet he got the room. A red pop-up box blinked in the reflection. Access denied pending revenue verification. She caught it instantly. Derek stiffened ever so slightly, but kept his expression neutral, casually dragging the alert window to the side and minimizing it as though it had been nothing but a technical hiccup. He glanced up and said, "We're just running some updates this week. Nothing to worry about." She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't offer even the grace of pretending to believe him. Instead, she noted the timestamp, logged it. That single denial wasn't a technical issue. It was a systemic block, an intentional freeze. Hale Bank's internal protocols did not trigger revenue verifications for institutional clients without an explicit red flag audit from risk assessment. And Laurel knew her portfolio had passed quarterly reviews with no discrepancies. More importantly, she knew this freeze had been enacted within the last 30 minutes. Since she'd arrived, since she'd been reclassified in the system, not as a verified entity, but as an unknown, a ghost. Derek cleared his throat and offered to reschedule the meeting with the investment committee, stating vaguely that today's slot had filled up due to a last-minute asset review session involving high-priority clients. He made it sound bureaucratic, like a scheduling mishap, but Laurel didn't miss the carefully chosen phrasing. High-priority clients, shifted prospects. The implication was clear. Someone had decided she no longer belonged in that circle. Her name had been quietly struck from the day's agenda, and the meeting that had taken weeks of strategic coordination had been reassigned, likely to someone with a familiar face and a lighter skin tone. She asked when the committee might reconvene with her. Derek offered a toothless smile and said someone would reach out if relevant. The words hovered in the air like second-hand smoke, thick with dismissal. If relevant. As if an 8-figure investment package could be irrelevant. As if the discretionary authority of one of the top emerging capital groups in the Northeast could be brushed aside with a vague promise to reconnect later. Laurel did not reply. Instead, she turned and walked to the window, looking out over the skyline with studied stillness. The city below moved in its usual rhythm, cars inching along gridlocked arteries, cranes frozen mid-swing, people rushing in and out of mirrored lobbies. It was a theater of ambition. And inside this particular tower, someone had tried to write her out of the script. While Derek tapped at his keyboard behind her, no doubt logging his interaction into the CRM with some neutral phrasing like client-reviewed documentation, no further action at this time. Laurel opened her phone, not to send a message, but to check something critical. She wasn't connected to the guest Wi-Fi. The bank's system hadn't granted her temporary access. Another deliberate omission. She moved back toward the desk and reached for her folder. Derek pretended not to notice. She waited a beat, then asked calmly, "Would you mind if I reviewed the latest positions report with the portfolio team?" There was a pause. Not long, but enough. Derek replied, "I believe they're currently in a strategy session. Let me see when they're available." He began typing again, and Laurel returned to her seat without waiting for an answer. She knew exactly what he'd find, no available sessions, or perhaps the suggestion that the team had been redirected to more active accounts. Another way of saying, "You're frozen. Your background noise now." She opened her folder once more, exposing a full-color diagram of vertical fund structures and transition points that had taken weeks of planning. Each line represented millions. Each transition, a coordinated execution strategy that would affect at least 3 multi-market sectors. Derek didn't glance down. He said, "We can keep this on file for future consideration," and placed a manila envelope over it. Not only had he ignored the content, he'd covered it physically with a generic Hale Bank envelope. A symbolic burial. Laurel slowly removed the envelope and placed it aside, recentering her documents on the table, not because she needed to, but because this moment required absolute precision. She wasn't being denied service. She was being erased, dismantled quietly, muted. The door opened again, this time without a knock. A senior assistant walked in, dropped a black folder on Derek's desk, nodded curtly at Laurel without a word, and left. The folder bore the crest of Ridgemar Capital, a firm with less than 1/5 the influence of Wynn Group Holdings. Laurel didn't look at it. She didn't need to. The signal was obvious. While her account was frozen for revenue verification, less capable players were being ushered into decision-making slots. She had been pushed out of the active pool. No documentation, no confrontation, just a silent shuffling of cards beneath the table. She stood again, slowly, and gathered her documents. Derek opened his mouth, maybe to stall her, maybe to salvage the optics, but Laurel cut through his hesitation by simply turning toward the door. She paused only once, placing her card neatly on the edge of the desk. Not the business card with her title, not the one with her personal line, but a black card with no contact, just a single embossed identifier, L.Wynn Strategic Principal Clearance Tier I. She didn't wait for him to pick it up. But Laurel noticed what they didn't say more than what they did. Silence could be a strategy, and inside Hale Bank, it was a weapon. Then the digital signage above the check-in kiosk caught her attention. Mounted above the reception desk, the rotating LED screen usually displayed routine messages, corporate mottos, greetings in multiple languages, updates on quarterly goals. But now, the message was different. It was bolder, blunter, and unmistakably pointed. In large text, it read, "Help us maintain elite standards, flag and expedite mismatched financial profiles." The font was crisp, white against dark navy. Underneath the message, the reflective black surface caught Laurel's image, her full silhouette centered perfectly beneath the words. She stood in place, not moving, allowing the message to linger just long enough for anyone watching to register what they were meant to infer. She was the mismatched profile. She was the anomaly they were broadcasting without naming. The sign flashed again, repeating its loop, unbothered by the weight of its implication. Laurel turned her gaze briefly toward the side lounge, where two middle-aged men in tailored suits sat watching. One of them looked away quickly. The other didn't. His eyes met hers for a moment, not out of curiosity, but calculation, as if he was trying to decide whether to categorize her as a glitch or a threat. She gave him nothing to work with. Instead, she turned and walked deliberately to the main seating area. As she approached, she noticed something else, more subtle, more corrosive. The ambient music had changed. No longer the soft, classical playlist that usually filled the air in upscale financial spaces. The speakers now emitted a strange loop of sounds, the mechanical rattle of a money counter, followed by a high-pitched beep, then the unmistakable tearing of paper. Then, faint but intentional, a burst of canned laughter. It repeated every 30 seconds. At first, it might have passed as abstract, but Laurel listened closely. After the third cycle, the intention was clear. It wasn't music, it was mockery. A second sound effect entered the rotation, an old-school jingle from a payday loan commercial, the kind that aired at midnight, targeting the desperate with promises of instant approval and no credit check. The melody was familiar to anyone who'd ever grown up hearing it during late-night reruns. Laurel had never forgotten it. Neither had anyone who'd once been broke. It was a song designed to shame. The melody bounced through the lobby, threading itself between the glass walls, hitting her ears like a jeer in disguise. No one else seemed to acknowledge it, not directly. But she saw how the woman behind the coffee bar stopped humming along once she saw Laurel approaching. How a nearby security guard smiled to himself while pretending to scan a clipboard. How another client, young, white, dressed in a navy blazer, pulled out his phone and began filming the screen discreetly, pretending to check messages while angling the camera toward the sign above her head. Laurel walked to the center of the space, where a minimalist art sculpture stood, a jagged spiral of brushed steel twisting upward like a frozen cyclone. She stood beside it, the metallic surface reflecting her again, this time distorted, bent. Her reflection wavered as the sign above her flickered once more. Protect client trust. Report suspicious activity with discretion. The words weren't just hollow, they were weaponized. Everything was coded yet unmistakable. She was being framed in real time as an interloper, not through confrontation, but through optics, through the environment. And everyone in the room was being recruited into complicity, made to see her not as who she was, but as what the system implied. She moved away from the sculpture, walking slowly, controlling the space the way only someone trained in boardroom warfare could. But no strategy could unwrite the messaging that surrounded her. She passed a digital directory that had suddenly updated to remove her company's listing under scheduled consultations. Instead, it now displayed, when holding status, in review. In review was a term used when accounts were being flagged, audited, or transitioned out. It suggested exposure, instability, risk. It was a subtle redirection meant for clients who might search for her firm's name and find, instead of validation, a question mark. A warning. She made her way to the glass elevator, where a slim man in a navy Hailbank vest stood holding the door. He offered a half smile and asked too casually, "Sure you're in the right place?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The question was rhetorical, meant to land like a jab. The doors closed behind her without another word. She found herself standing once again at the reception desk, this time in the Legal Affairs Division, a place she had no official business, but where the bank had summoned her with a cold formality that brooked no refusal. The clerk behind the counter barely glanced up as she placed a thick, stamped envelope before Laurel. The envelope was plain white, without logos or embellishments, but the bold red stamp across the top read, "Mandatory Declaration, Third-Party Representation Exclusion." Laurel broke the seal and unfolded the document inside. The form required her to assert, under penalty of internal disciplinary action, that she was not acting as a representative or legal agent of any company other than her own, an exclusion clause designed to disqualify anyone perceived as an external actor meddling in the bank's core client relationships. The irony was cruelly transparent. It was an attempt to redefine her as an outsider despite her clear and long-standing ties to the bank's clientele. But what made the form especially offensive was how it overlaid this disclaimer directly atop her own printed name and title, almost as if to obscure her true identity beneath layers of bureaucratic suspicion. The entire document was a legal mirage, constructed to deny her legitimacy without requiring any direct confrontation or discussion. Laurel sat down in the hard wooden chair next to the counter, signed the form with her usual precision, and handed it back. The clerk nodded curtly but did not meet her gaze. Laurel could feel the weight of the office around her, gray walls lined with rows of thick binders, the hum of aging computers, and the faint smell of burnt coffee that permeated the air. This place was where power was hidden behind paperwork, and where identities were often rewritten with a stroke of a pen. Unwilling to accept this erasure, Laurel proceeded to file an official complaint through the bank's internal grievance portal, meticulously detailing the series of slights, blockades, and exclusions she had experienced since her arrival. She included attachments of emails, screenshots, and the stamped exclusion form, ensuring that every facet of her case was documented with unassailable clarity. But the response was swift and final. Her submission was auto-flagged by the system as spam content, an algorithmic judgment rendered without human review. The confirmation email that arrived in her inbox came from a cold, impersonal address, norripley-disqualified@hailbank.com. There was no acknowledgement of the specifics of her complaint, no indication that it would be escalated or even read. Just a curt automated message: "Your submission cannot be processed. Please contact support for further assistance." Laurel stared at the message for a long moment, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes, before she closed the laptop deliberately. This act of digital dismissal was perhaps the clearest signal, yet that Hailbank sought not just to silence her voice, but to erase her from the institution's records and memory. To the bank's internal systems, she had become a ghost, an anomaly to be ignored, an error to be forgotten. Determined not to let the institution's cold mechanisms define her, Laurel requested a meeting with the bank's compliance director, hoping to speak directly with someone who might recognize the gravity of the situation. The invitation she received in return was terse and condescending, a calendar appointment scheduled in a cramped, windowless office on a Friday afternoon, the least convenient time possible. When she arrived, the compliance director, a man named Richard Klein, greeted her with a faint smile that barely masked a sense of superiority. He had the practiced demeanor of a man accustomed to dealing with difficult clients, and Laurel could sense that to him. She was precisely that. The discussion quickly turned to semantics, policies, and procedural technicalities, with Richard insisting that all actions taken against her were consistent with the bank's rigorous standards, and that any delays or limitations were routine safeguards applied evenly. Laurel countered with evidence and precise dates, pointing out that such safeguards had never before been applied to clients of comparable scale and tenure. Klein nodded politely but remained unmoved, concluding the meeting with a thinly veiled warning that continued noncompliance could lead to further restrictions. The message was clear. She was not welcome to push back. Outside the office, Laurel took a moment to collect herself before heading back to the elevators. Her phone buzzed silently in her bag, a reminder of messages she had deferred, calls she had postponed. But she didn't check it. Instead, she reflected on the nature of the battle unfolding around her. It was no longer just a question of access or meeting room assignments. It was an institutional campaign to rewrite who she was, to cast doubt on her legitimacy, to sever her ties invisibly but irrevocably. In this silent war, the weapons were forms, flags, and filters, tools wielded by people who preferred that power be invisible, impartial, and unquestioned. Yet Laurel's resolve only hardened. The erasure they sought to impose was a challenge she would meet with meticulous strategy. This fight, she knew, would not be won in courtrooms or boardrooms alone, but in the quiet accumulation of truth against systemic denial. Approaching her car, she noticed something immediately wrong. A bright orange boot clamped tightly onto the front left tire, effectively immobilizing the vehicle. Her breath caught. This was no accident. The sign on the boot cited violation of premium zone parking policy, a charge that was both ridiculous and suspicious, considering her valid pass was displayed on the windshield, visible from every angle. She took a deep breath and reached for her phone to call the parking management. The line rang endlessly, finally connecting to a voicemail that offered no explanation and promised a callback that never came. She looked around for a security guard or attendant, but none were in sight. There was a small kiosk at the lot entrance, but the attendant was nowhere to be found. The surveillance cameras overhead hummed faintly, their red lights blinking steadily, recording everything. Laurel's frustration grew when she learned from the parking office that access to the footage was restricted, citing privacy policies and internal security protocols. No one would grant her permission to review the tape to prove her rightful parking or identify who authorized the boot. It was a blatant power play, an act of sabotage designed to inconvenience, humiliate, and remind her that her presence was unwanted beyond the bank's interior walls. While Laurel stood contemplating her options, she noticed something fluttering on the windshield wiper, a flyer, folded neatly and pressed under the blade. Curiosity mixed with a sense of foreboding as she carefully unfolded the paper. The message was short, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. Invest where your class is respected. Don't get mistaken for a fraud. There was no logo, no contact information, no signature. Just those words, printed in cold, sans serif typeface on a stark white background. The message wasn't an invitation, it was a warning. Laurel folded the flyer slowly, pocketing it with deliberate care. She knew what it meant. It was a veiled threat, a reminder that despite her power and influence, she was still being policed, othered, and surveilled. The anonymity of the message suggested it was sent from within the bank's own ecosystem, or at least from someone intimately familiar with the subtle mechanisms of exclusion that Hale Bank employed. Her mind flashed back to the lobby's taunting digital signboards and the altered playlist that had looped those demeaning sound bites. The campaign against her was multifaceted, Beyond the meeting rooms, beyond the frozen accounts and erased identities, it was a coordinated assault on her presence in every space she touched. The car boot was the physical manifestation of that assault, a real-world metaphor for the bureaucratic shackles they tried to place on her professional freedom. Yet, Laurel was no stranger to such tactics. Years of navigating spaces that weren't designed for people like her had taught her to read the signs, literal and figurative, and to meet each challenge with strategic patience. As she stood beside her immobilized car, Laurel pulled out her folder once more, the one that had been met with silence and dismissal inside the bank. She laid it on the hood carefully, smoothing the pages so that the investment plans were visible even to passing eyes. Nearby, a security camera rotated slowly toward her direction. She noticed, but did not flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and extracted a small, encrypted device, a portable drive containing backup copies of her entire portfolio, legal clearances, and correspondence. She connected it to her phone, initiating an immediate secure transfer to her personal cloud. This was precaution, not paranoia. The battle she was engaged in was as much digital as it was physical, fought in the shadows of internal systems and under the harsh light of corporate optics. Every piece of data had to be protected, preserved, and prepared for the eventual counterstrike. The quiet murmur of a bank employee's voice drifted from a nearby window, where a security guard sat at a desk. Laurel caught fragments: high-profile disruptions, protocol breach, risk to client confidentiality. She knew they were discussing her. They had cataloged her presence as a problem, a threat to the polished image they curated so meticulously. The flyer on her windshield was just one small thread in a web of intimidation. It was designed to make her doubt herself, to nudge her toward retreat. But Laurel was resolute. Each act of exclusion fueled her determination rather than extinguished it. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered on and the office towers transformed into glowing silhouettes against the night sky, Laurel sat in her temporary apartment reviewing the day's events. She mapped out the layers of obstruction she had encountered, from the security guard's unyielding check at the door to the digital erasure of her name, from the freezing of her accounts to the physical boot on her car. Each was a brick in a wall meant to contain her. Yet, like water, she intended to find every crack, every opening. The flyer's words echoed in her mind: invest where your class is respected. She understood the code embedded within those words, the unstated prejudice they masked. But she also knew the truth behind them, that her class, her influence, and her claim to power were real and undeniable. The sun was just beginning to cast golden streaks across the city skyline, and the building's reflective glass facade mirrored the awakening metropolis in its towering glass panels. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with the nervous energy of executives preparing for the day's board meeting, whispered conversations blending with the hum of computer terminals and the click of heels on marble floors. Laurel's destination was no longer the dusty back rooms or the passive lobbies, but the heart of the institution's power. The VIP boardroom and shareholder council chambers, where the bank's most sensitive decisions were made. As she approached the restricted elevator bank, the biometric scanner installed next to the door came into view. This device was among the most advanced security measures in the building, designed to grant access only to the highest tiers of stakeholders and executives. Laurel paused, lifting her hand and pressing her palm firmly against the glass reader. The scanner blinked, lights dancing in a sequence that was at once mechanical and almost ritualistic. A soft chime sounded, followed by a brief vibration under her fingers, and the heavy steel door slid open, revealing a corridor bathed in soft white light. Behind her, the security personnel monitoring the area exchanged startled glances. She was not expected to pass so easily, not without prior announcement or formal invitation. Yet, the system recognized her biometric imprint instantly and without hesitation, her fingerprint, a literal key to the bank's inner sanctum. Walking through the corridor, Laurel felt the weight of countless eyes, real and electronic, tracking her progress. Cameras with motion detection pivoted slowly as she passed, some connected to facial recognition software that quietly cross-referenced her against internal databases. She was no longer the outsider flagged as mismatched profile or pending verification. In these moments, she was the embodiment of authority itself. The sterile hallway opened into a vast room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. To her left stood a large, curved digital display, the Honor Wall, a rotating gallery dedicated to the bank's most influential partners and investors. As Laurel stepped forward, the AI-powered system detected her presence and shifted focus. Her image emerged on the screen, accompanied by her name and title in elegant, glowing letters. Laurel Wynn, Strategic Principal, Wynn Group Holdings. The room fell into a hush, the buzz of conversation momentarily silenced, as an executive seated near the display froze in disbelief. He was a senior bank director, known for his unshakable composure, yet his gaze betrayed surprise and something approaching unease. The wall did not make mistakes. It was programmed to activate only for those whose portfolios met the bank's highest thresholds. The appearance of Laurel's profile was a public and unequivocal declaration. She was a major player, a force to be reckoned with, and her presence here was no accident. Laurel acknowledged the gathering silently, her calm confidence filling the room more than any words could. The display rotated, cycling through financial achievements, capital under management, and influence scores, all pointing to her firm's control over billions in assets. It was a digital monument, one she hadn't asked for but had earned, and the bank had no choice but to acknowledge. Nearby, an assistant hurried to notify the senior management team, their reaction a mix of whispered urgency and visible discomfort. Laurel's presence had shifted the balance. No longer could she be ignored or sidelined. Moments later, Laurel found herself standing before the entrance to the shareholder council chamber, a room so secure that even most senior employees required escort to enter. The door was reinforced, guarded by another biometric device, this one configured for palm vein recognition, a level of security few possessed clearance to use. Laurel placed her hand on the scanner once again. The machine hummed softly, analyzed the unique pattern of blood vessels beneath her skin, and within seconds, the door unlocked with a smooth hydraulic hiss. As it opened, Laurel stepped through a threshold that separated observers from decision-makers, spectators from the initiated. Behind her, a ripple of alarm spread through the bank's upper echelons. Panic flashed briefly in the eyes of executives who had spent months attempting to marginalize her. Their calculated exclusions, their digital erasures, their quiet sabotages, they had underestimated the strength of her claim. Inside the chamber, Laurel was greeted not with suspicion, but with deference. The shareholders' council was mid-discussion when she entered, but conversation paused, and eyes turned toward her with a mixture of respect and awe. The chairperson, an imposing woman with decades of financial governance experience, nodded briefly and motioned for Laurel to join the table. As Laurel took her seat, she felt the quiet thrum of power beneath the polished wood, a sense that her battle had reached a turning point. Here, in the center of the bank's authority, she was recognized as the strategic principal. She was no longer a subject of erasure, but an agent of influence. The council session continued, but Laurel's impact was palpable. Documents, once withheld, now made their way to her hands. Discussions that had previously excluded her featured her perspectives prominently. The systems that had blocked her access began to yield. The power to negotiate, to influence, to direct was back within her grasp. More importantly, the bank's internal politics had shifted. Managers who had previously dismissed her found themselves forced to recalibrate their approach, wary of the consequences of further marginalization. Laurel's presence in this chamber was a warning and a promise. She was reclaiming her space, and nothing would be overlooked again. Access to this floor required multi-factor authentication, encrypted credentials, and personal biometric validation. But for Laurel, who now wielded strategic principal clearance, the path was unobstructed. Her palm hovered over the scanner once again, and with a familiar soft beep and green glow, the steel doors slid open to reveal the vast expanse of blinking consoles, digital dashboards, and banks of monitors displaying live financial feeds. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with quiet urgency. Traders and financial analysts sat at their stations, eyes flicking across screens tracking currency fluctuations, stock movements, and investment portfolios. Yet when Laurel entered, a subtle shift rippled through the room. Dozens of glances turned, some cautious, some respectful. The systems she had once been locked out of now hummed with her command authority. She moved directly to the central command console, where a massive touch interface displayed the bank's largest active holdings, flagged accounts, and pending transfer requests. With steady hands, Laurel accessed the Win Group Holdings portfolio, which dominated several sectors with a combined valuation exceeding $8 billion. Without hesitation, she initiated the liquidation protocol she had prepared meticulously. A bright red command flashed on the main console. Absolute authority confirmed initiate $8.4 billion liquidation principle. Win Group Holdings. This was no ordinary transfer. It was an orchestrated withdrawal designed to reallocate assets from Hale Bank's holdings back into diversified ventures under Win Group's control. The system responded instantly, verifying multi-layered security protocols including digital signatures, biometric validations, and encrypted key authorizations, all matching Laurel's credentials. The command cascaded through automated channels, triggering alerts to compliance, treasury, and asset management teams. The transfer was seamless and irrevocable. As the transaction unfolded, the repercussions became immediately evident elsewhere in the bank. The control panel that managed branch-level operations and regional oversight flashed a critical warning. Derek Nile, the branch manager who had spearheaded efforts to marginalize Laurel, received an abrupt suspension of his system access. His executive credentials were force reset under a protocol labeled internal declassification due to conduct deviation. This was a rarely used measure reserved for individuals whose actions conflicted with shareholder mandates or violated internal governance. In effect, Derek was digitally exiled, his authority stripped without formal public disclosure, his digital footprint scrubbed from the systems he once commanded. This silent demotion carried with it not only professional disgrace, but a clear message to others who might attempt similar subversions. Within minutes, the bank's internal network buzzed with activity. Notifications were sent discreetly to senior executives and compliance officers, informing them of the large-scale asset movement and the immediate administrative changes at the branch level. Yet no public announcement was made. No press release heralded the shift. This was a battle fought in the shadows, in the language of codes and encrypted commands, far from the prying eyes of clients and media. Laurel understood the necessity of such discretion. Power, she knew, was most effective when wielded silently, its consequences profound, but its mechanisms unseen. Elsewhere in the building, the mood among senior management was palpably tense. Group chats and private messages speculated about the unexpected liquidation request and the sudden removal of Derek's access. Some expressed disbelief, others unease. Questions circulated about how Laurel had circumvented months of institutional obstruction to reclaim her position and exercise such sweeping control. Yet none dared confront the truth openly. The quiet acknowledgement was that the bank's internal dynamics had irrevocably shifted. Those who had treated Laurel as an outsider now faced the reality of her unassailable influence. Meanwhile, Laurel returned to her office, a space she had reclaimed through persistence and strategy. She reviewed the transaction logs, ensuring that each phase of the liquidation complied with regulatory standards and that all necessary oversight had been engaged. The system's compliance checks, which had once blocked her access, now flagged no issues. Every protocol, every safeguard, had been navigated flawlessly. Her smile was subtle but resolute. This was not just a financial maneuver. It was a restoration of rightful power. In the days that followed, Hale Bank's operations began to show signs of strain. Asset portfolios under Win Group Holdings were systematically withdrawn, causing ripples across the bank's liquidity and capital allocation. Stock prices reacted accordingly, drawing the attention of market analysts and industry watchers. Internally, the removal of Derek Nile and others implicated in obstructing Laurel's influence sent shockwaves through the organizational hierarchy. departmental restructurings, policy revisions, and heightened security protocols were quietly implemented to manage the fallout. Laurel, however, remained focused on the long game. The silent authority she now commanded was both a shield and a sword. It protected her from further marginalization and empowered her to reshape the financial landscape according to principles of fairness and strategic growth. Her experience had taught her that real power was not about public spectacle, but about control over the systems that govern wealth and influence. By activating this authority discreetly, she had not only reclaimed her position, but had signaled to the institution that attempts to suppress her would no longer be tolerated. Traders on the floor reacted with stunned urgency, many scrambling to reassess their positions as the market recalibrated to the sudden withdrawal of billions in assets. The headlines flashed across screens and smartphones. Wynn Holdings cuts ties, sparks crisis at Hale Bank. Major investor departure sends shockwaves through financial sector. Hale Bank faces unprecedented liquidity crunch after Wynn Group pullout. The media frenzy was relentless, drawing attention not only to the financial impact, but also to the backstory of internal conflict and systemic bias that had precipitated this upheaval. Within hours, a flood of leaked internal documents surfaced online, exposing a trove of confidential bank memos and reports that had long been hidden from public view. These files detailed patterns of bias, discrimination, and deliberate obstruction targeting Laurel Wynn and Wynn Holdings, a calculated campaign orchestrated by senior staff to marginalize one of their most powerful clients. The revelations included emails discussing client profile mismatches, meeting minutes showing plans to limit access and influence of certain investors, and risk assessment reports manipulated to flag Wynn Holdings' portfolio for undue scrutiny. What made the leak particularly explosive was the method of decryption. These documents, encrypted and secured behind multiple layers of authorization, had been unlocked using an executive-level digital key tied to Laurel's biometric profile. This key had remained dormant, inactive, and inaccessible within the bank systems, until Laurel's re-establishment of authority had granted her access. The use of her biometric credentials to unveil the buried documents transformed what could have been a mere data breach into a powerful act of institutional exposure. The documents were not just evidence. They were a testament to her resilience and strategic acumen. The media coverage quickly expanded beyond financial news into broader discussions about corporate ethics, racial bias, and the culture of exclusivity within elite banking institutions. Commentary pieces questioned how a client as prominent and legitimate as Laurel Wynn could be subjected to such treatment, and why the bank's governance structures had failed to prevent systemic discrimination. Industry analysts debated the long-term implications for Hale Bank's reputation and stability, with some predicting that the crisis would prompt regulatory investigations and calls for greater transparency in wealth management practices. Social media platforms amplified the story, with hashtags demanding accountability and justice trending among diverse audiences. Laurel's personal story became emblematic of larger societal struggles for recognition and fairness in spaces traditionally closed off to those who did not fit the established mold. Inside Hale Bank, the mood was grim and uncertain. Senior executives convened emergency meetings to address the fallout, scrambling to formulate damage control strategies. The bank's legal department worked overtime, coordinating responses to media inquiries, preparing statements, and managing shareholder relations. Meanwhile, departments across the institution faced cascading disruptions as clients reacted to the public revelations. Wealth management teams saw withdrawals spike, corporate clients reconsidered partnerships, and internal morale plummeted amid the unfolding crisis. The management team that had once dismissed Laurel's influence now found themselves grappling with the very consequences they had sought to avoid. Amid the chaos, Derek Niles' suspension became emblematic of the bank's internal reckoning. His ousting was no longer a private administrative action, but a public symbol of systemic failure. Former colleagues whispered about investigations into his conduct, with allegations of discriminatory practices and abuse of power gaining traction. The narrative had shifted dramatically, from a story of one woman's fight for recognition to a larger reckoning, with entrenched institutional prejudice and governance lapses. Board members faced mounting pressure to overhaul policies and leadership to restore confidence and rebuild trust with stakeholders. Laurel, despite the storm swirling around her, maintained a composed and strategic posture. From her vantage point, she monitored market data, regulatory filings, and news cycles, coordinating with her legal and communications teams to manage the narrative. Her approach was not one of retaliation, but of restoration and reform, using the crisis as a platform to advocate for change within the banking industry and beyond. She engaged with journalists and industry leaders selectively, ensuring that her message emphasized fairness, transparency, and the dismantling of exclusionary practices. Her public appearances were measured and powerful, reinforcing her role not only as a business leader, but as a catalyst for systemic change. Behind the scenes, Laurel worked closely with cybersecurity experts and forensic accountants to secure and analyze the leaked documents. This team identified additional layers of misconduct, traced communication chains, and mapped networks of complicity within Hale Bank's operations. Their findings formed the basis for formal complaints to regulatory bodies and eventually legal actions aimed at addressing the discrimination and systemic failures exposed by the leak. Laurel's strategy combined public pressure with institutional accountability, leveraging both media scrutiny and legal frameworks to ensure that the bank would be compelled to reform. The atmosphere inside the Hale Bank executive chamber was thick with quiet finality as Laurel Wynn stood alone before the vast control panel that governed the bank's most sensitive operations. The room, usually buzzing with a low hum of simultaneous conversations and brisk movements of executives, was now enveloped in a hushed stillness, a silence born not of absence, but of resolution. Laurel's back faced the camera mounted high in the corner of the room, its lens capturing every subtle movement in unblinking clarity. Before her, the multi-screen console glowed ominously, the central display scrolling lines of red text that spelled out in stark digital language, "Access Level 0 Final Command Ready." The words pulsed rhythmically, an electronic heartbeat signaling the culmination of a long and arduous battle for control. Laurel's gaze was steady, her demeanor calm yet commanding. Without hesitation, she gave a single deliberate nod, a gesture both succinct and powerful, conveying the weight of the authority she now held and the decisions she was poised to enact. This was more than a symbolic moment. It was the execution of a verdict not just on an individual, but on a system that had for too long perpetuated exclusion and injustice. The command she activated initiated the permanent disabling of access privileges for those who had orchestrated the campaign against her, starting with Derek Nile, the branch manager whose name had become synonymous with obstruction and discrimination. The digital protocols ensured that his executive accounts, credentials, and permissions were irrevocably terminated. His office was slated for closure, the physical space he once controlled soon to be sealed off from further use. These were not mere bureaucratic actions, but the tangible dismantling of a power structure that had been built on bias and unchecked privilege. Within the following week, as security personnel changed locks and IT specialists executed data purges, a small but telling sign appeared on the door of Derek's former office. A junior employee, given the task perhaps more out of duty than desire, taped a plain white notice bearing a stark message: removed by order of strategic shareholder decision not subject to appeal. The words echoed the finality of the digital commands Laurel had set in motion, reinforcing that this was a decision beyond contestation. Every digital trace of Derek's tenure, from email archives to client communications and access logs, was methodically expunged. The system ensured there was no lingering shadow of his influence within the institution, no digital footprint to be resurrected or exploited. It was a complete and irreversible erasure, a modern form of institutional justice. The reverberations of these actions extended beyond the confines of Hale Bank. News of the removals and the sweeping reforms that followed spread quickly through industry circles, signaling to other financial institutions the consequences of systemic bias and mismanagement. Hale Bank's transformation became a cautionary tale about the price of exclusion and the power of determined individuals to demand accountability. In boardrooms across the country, executives referenced the bank's downfall and resurrection as evidence that no entity, regardless of stature or history, was immune from scrutiny or change. For Laurel, however, this closure was not an end, but a beginning. Standing in that empty chamber, watching the glowing words scroll across the screen, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The years of subtle dismissals, public humiliations, and institutional erasures had forged a resolve that no bureaucracy could break. Her victory was not merely personal. It was a statement, a declaration that systems built on inequality could be dismantled, that power could be reclaimed by those who refused to be invisible. Her calm nod was a testament to the fact that true authority was measured not by force or spectacle, but by quiet confidence and unyielding perseverance. As Hale Bank moved forward, restructuring itself under new leadership and more inclusive governance, Laurel took on a new role, not just as a principal investor, but as an advocate for systemic reform. She worked with regulatory bodies to implement stronger safeguards against discrimination, championed initiatives promoting diversity in finance, and mentored emerging leaders from underrepresented backgrounds. Her story became a beacon of hope and a blueprint for transformation, illustrating how resilience and strategic action could overcome entrenched barriers. The final message of Laurel's journey echoed beyond financial metrics and corporate governance. It was a reminder that justice, when pursued with clarity and determination, could outlast obstruction and silence. That the path to equity was often paved with patience, vigilance, and the courage to stand firm in the face of adversity. And that true change required not only the dismantling of old systems, but the deliberate construction of new ones, built on inclusion, respect, and shared humanity. In the quiet aftermath, as the lights dimmed in the Hale Bank headquarters and the city moved on beneath a sky filled with stars, Laurel Wynn's legacy was no longer confined to balance sheets or boardrooms. It was woven into the fabric of a broader movement, one that demanded recognition for all voices and justice for all those too long ignored. The cold verdict she enacted was not just the conclusion of a battle, but the opening of a door through which many would follow, carrying forward the promise that no one would be unseen or unheard again. The end. Thanks for reading this intense story of power and justice. If you enjoyed the journey, please like and subscribe to support more stories like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the plot surprised you the most? Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and join the conversation.